In the last decade, we've seen mobile technologies go leaps and bounds above what the desktop counterparts have been offering. If you look at the performance of the early iPhones in the early 2010s versus the iPhones we have out today, the iPhone 11, iPhone 12, you can see that there's an exponential growth in terms of processing capability between the early phones and the phones of today. Some of these phones even have good enough performance that they're sometimes as good, if not slightly better, than lower end laptops or even mid-range laptops, if you're buying Apple, that is. So, why did I bring this up today? Qualcomm is about to release their Snapdragon 888 SoC. The big thing about this is it's also on the 5nm node. Apple's A14 chips on their mobile and the M1 chips on their laptops were kind of the first series to get the 5nm process node, and now we're about to see Qualcomm manufacture their own chips with the 5nm node. The Snapdragon 888 being the big high-end performer. So why is this one important? Well, Qualcomm is actually claiming about a 30 to 35% performance increase over the previous generation of Qualcomm chips, which brings the new Snapdragon 888 almost on par with the iPhone 11 level of performance. I know that might not sound that impressive, but if you actually look over the last couple of years, especially since Apple started manufacturing their own mobile chips, the Android chips really haven't been able to catch up over the last 5-6 years in terms of performance per watt, so efficiency, and even in terms of raw power over that time period. Apple has started their own chips and they've matched what Qualcomm's been able to offer and beat them. There's multiple reasons why. One of the main ones being that Apple controls both the hardware and software and all the decisions related to those things for their phones and their iPads, and now they even have their Apple Silicon for their MacBooks. Whereas Qualcomm has to make these chips work well for multiple different types of devices and multiple different manufacturers. So you're going to lose some efficiency numbers there, but now we have performance numbers for the Snapdragon 888. So I wanted to take a bit of a look into those to see what we can expect out of the next generation of Android phones, and if they're going to be able to give you a comparable experience to iPhones. So all of the performance numbers that I'm going to talk about are going to be from the AnandTech article, and I'll have it linked below in my description so that you can take a deeper look if you want to. The first score is the Geekbench 5 scores. This one tests a lot of CPU-bound tasks. So looking at these performance numbers, it tells you pretty much how snappy the UI experience is going to be. So when you're opening apps, when you're closing apps, if you have a bunch of apps open, switching between them, how fast that's going to be. Your typing experience, how quickly you're able to type on the keyboards, that's going to be determined by how fast the CPU is. Let's take a look at how these performance numbers look. Okay, so we have 1135 on the single core and 3794 on the multi-core. If you look at the iPhone 11, the single core performance on the iPhone 11 is at 1331 and the multi-core is 3366. So the Qualcomm single core performance at 1135 is actually a bit slower than the iPhone 11s, but the multi-core performance of 3794 is better than the iPhone 11 Pro, but a bit worse than the iPhone 12 Pro, which gets a bit over 4,000. Even with the 5nm upgrade, you're getting slightly less performance than you would be able to on an Apple device. But remember, the phones that are going to be available with this chip are going to be much more varied, and you're going to have many different options for what you want to use compared to Apple, where you're kind of stuck with the newest iPhone and the design of the new iPhone. And if you don't like it, well, that's too bad. You can't really get a different one if you wanted to. But the Snapdragon 888 is probably going to be available on a bunch of devices with fairly long-term support. And let's take a look at how far they've come compared to some of their previous chips. The Snapdragon 865 Plus, which was their last gen chip, not on the 5nm node, only got a 983 on the single core and 3245 on the multi-core. So this is significantly better, like 20%-ish on the single core, and also about a bit less than 20%-ish on the multi-core. Not the biggest jump in the world, but still significant, and it brings it a lot closer in terms of performance to the iPhones, which is kind of what we're looking for here. You want as snappy of an experience as possible on Android, considering that the chipset and phone manufacturers aren't actually the same people. Getting as much performance as you can out of the CPU straight out of the bat is going to be very important in how Android feels for you. These chips are actually very efficient compared to their older counterparts. They're using the Cortex-X1 in the new chipset, and these cores are actually clocked at 2.84 GHz, the same as the A77 cores in the previous generation S865, and slightly lower clock than the 865 Plus. The core count is basically the same. The clock speed is the same, so most of these improvements are coming from the IPC gain. IPC is basically how much stuff the CPU is able to do for every clock cycle. So when you hear the 2.84 GHz, it means that for each of those gigahertz, it's able to do a bit more. That's pretty cool, actually. That's significant. So now let's move on to the GPU performance. And this is where you kind of see how Apple dominates and Android does fall a bit behind on a lot of these cases. The Snapdragon 888 has the Adreno 660 GPU, which according to Qualcomm is supposed to give about a 35% performance gain. And Qualcomm published the Aztec Ruins GFX benchmark, where the Snapdragon 888 got 86 FPS, and that's a lot higher than what they could get on the 865 Plus, which was sitting at about 60 peak and 46 average. But the interesting part is the iPhone SE, the iPhone 11, and the iPhone 12 are all above this. If you're looking to game on your phone, if you have the option of choosing between Android and iOS, that might be something to consider. Even the latest version of the Snapdragon 888 chip, which still isn't out yet on phones, the current iPhones all perform slightly better. But this is a benchmark, and actual game implementation is going to vary. But I am glad to see that Qualcomm is catching up. Compared to their previous best performing chips, the new one gets really close to the iPhone 11 and iPhone 12 level of performance. So if they can keep up this improvement in the next generation, they're going to get fairly close, if not catch up to the iPhone performance. But by then Apple might improve even more, so it's kind of hard to say. But for Android, you're definitely going to get the best Android gaming experience with the Snapdragon 888 chip. So something to keep in mind if you have to use Android and you want to play games on your phone. One thing they do comment on here is that the new Snapdragon 888 chip is actually going to support LPDDR5 6400. So that's the new DRAM that's going to be supported by this chip, which means significantly higher bandwidth on your memory. And for gaming applications, memory speed is very important. So that could contribute a lot to why the performance of the new chip is so much better than last gen Snapdragon chips. So the big improvement from the Snapdragon 888, and one of the things that Android chipset actually lacked for quite a while, is AI acceleration. And why is this important? Because on phones, you actually end up doing a lot of tasks that require AI acceleration than you would on your computer, if you're the average user, for example. So look at all the filters you use on places like Snapchat or TikTok. A lot of those applications can actually be accelerated with machine learning hardware if it's built into your chip. And previous generation Snapdragon chips weren't really good with that. They didn't really have purpose-built silicon inside the Snapdragon chips that could accelerate machine learning in a very easy, accessible way for developers, like Apple does. So in the Apple world, if you use MLKit to run some kind of machine learning algorithm on your phone for iPhones, it'll automatically accelerate that with the neural engine that's built into the chips. But on the Android side, that's actually not been very well supported, mainly because Qualcomm doesn't produce chips with good AI acceleration built in. But that's changing now, and they actually put out an AI inference benchmark to tell us how that works. You're not training models on this, you're using them. So AI inferencing is basically when you're using a model. And this makes sense because the Snapdragon 865 in the Note 20 Ultra got a score of 11,890. And the new Snapdragon 888 got a score of 32,228. Now, they're not telling us how this compares to Apple's neural engine, but what it does tell us is that the new Snapdragon chips are going to be fairly capable of doing AI accelerated tasks. So if you need to edit video, and let's say you want to crop out a person's face from the background, you want to add a green screen effect without actually having a green screen, these are things that you can accelerate with machine learning. And with this kind of chip, it makes it more likely that you'll be able to do things like that efficiently and quickly on your phone. You're never going to edit full 4K, 8K footage on your phone. That's probably not a good idea. But if you want to do a quick edit, if you're trying to just record something to post to YouTube, you can maybe do that with this kind of acceleration on these devices. And if you have the acceleration, developers will build the apps to work with it. So I'm glad to see that Qualcomm is finally taking the initiative to put hardware-based machine learning acceleration built in to their chips. And it's the same story with the other machine learning benchmarks. There's this benchmark that's kind of in the works called MLPerf, and what it does is it runs a bunch of different machine learning tasks on these devices to give you what kind of performance you can expect. And you can see that the Snapdragon 888 for image classification, it performs 3-4 times as better. If it's online, for offline, performs almost double the performance of the Snapdragon 865. Object detection, it's 3 times as good as the 865. Image segmentation, it's again almost 3.5 times as good. And for language processing, and this is where it's not as good, but it's still better than the previous generation 865. And I think that's where a lot of the performance gains are going to come. Language processing is very important. Whenever you're doing autocomplete, that's language processing. Whenever you're using Google Assistant, that's doing language processing. So having faster language processing means that your phone might feel a lot snappier, even if the CPU performance wasn't better. But the CPU performance is better, the language processing is better, which means you're going to get better autocomplete features, better Google Assistant features, or Amazon Alexa, or whatever you use for those kinds of tasks that tend to be used a lot on smartphones. You're going to notice some improvement from that language processing. For image segmentation, object detection, yeah, these are important, but these are things that you have to actively do in your app. On your camera, though, that might actually be helpful, because if you're able to segment images quickly and detect objects quickly, your camera app that's built into your phone that your manufacturer is providing you can be made to be better. Like it can give better exposure. It can figure out how to do exposure in a more smart way compared to before. So it'll help you take better pictures than non-AI accelerated camera apps. So I'm really glad to see this new chipset out of Qualcomm. We'll have to wait until the first couple of devices are out with this chip inside. But it's interesting to see how over the last couple of years, Android chipsets haven't really been able to compete against Apple. They've been lacking in some significant ways, and AI acceleration is one of them. GPU performance is another. But the new Snapdragon 888 is getting really close when it comes to that. All of these performance improvements, plus the fact that on the Snapdragon 888 you can actually have 3 photo streams simultaneously, which means you can, if you have 3 cameras on your phone, you can take a picture on each of those cameras simultaneously. That opens the door for multi-camera picture enhancement type situations. It's interesting how some of the hardware decisions that they made for just this generation of the Qualcomm chips directly translate to what consumers actually want to do with their phones. What do consumers want to do? They want to take good pictures, good video. They want to maybe sometimes edit these pictures and video on their phones, and having good camera level features, good machine learning acceleration, good single core performance are all going to help provide that. These benchmarks in this article doesn't actually tell us how power efficient this chip is, but a lot of this is going to depend on how phone manufacturers decide to actually run these chips. They can choose to underclock them, so run them at a slightly lower power draw with slightly lower performance, or slightly higher power draw and slightly higher performance, but that'll depend on the battery capacity, how efficiently they can use the batteries. But it's a 5nm chip, so I'm pretty sure it's going to be very efficient compared to previous gen Android devices. As we're going into 2021 and into a new decade, we're starting to see glimpses into what future developments are going to be like for the computer hardware and mobile hardware industries. The last year has seen a boon in hardware innovations that are coming out of chip fabrication nodes like TSMC, that are coming out of these manufacturers like Qualcomm, and now Apple is designing chips too. I think that compared to the 2010s, the early mid 2010s, where there was a lot of hardware stagnation in terms of performance, the early mid 2020s are going to be very different in that sense. We're going to see a lot of these hardware performance gains start to be realized as innovation ramps up once again. I mean, now there's competitors in every space. Intel isn't the only person you go to for a CPU anymore. You have AMD. Apple's joined the fray too. Apple's designing their own ARM chips. They have their own mobile chips that are extremely high performance. So Qualcomm has also got to step up their game, and it looks like they are stepping up their game with the new chip manufacturing. So we'll have to see how this pans out over the next couple of years, I haven't had an Android phone in forever, but now I'm kind of curious what kind of phones actually end up having the Snapdragon 888 inside, and how some of the software is actually going to use a lot of these performance improvements in it. I'm just super excited to see what is enabled on Android devices with this kind of ML acceleration, because this is unprecedented performance gains, and Android is a bit more open, so you're going to see a lot more creative uses of this hardware acceleration compared to what you really see on Apple devices. So that's it for me today. Leave your thoughts down below on whether the Snapdragon 888 series of chips are actually going to make you want to upgrade this upcoming year to a new Android phone, or if you're still going to hold off for a couple of years, or maybe if you're on the iOS camp, what do you guys think of the Snapdragon 888 and what it means for Android, and whether it'll convince you to switch to an Android phone later on down the line. Thanks for watching, everyone, and remember to always keep learning. Bye-bye.